Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the IAM Online, our monthly webinar on identity and access management. IAM Online is sponsored by InCommon and Internet2 and the EDUCAUSE Higher Education Information Security Council. We'll be taking questions by the chat today, and if you look down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat button. In order to see the chat, you click on that button. The default for the dropdown you will see is to send messages just to the panelists. So if you would change that when you send a message to send it to everybody, that way we can all see the questions and everybody will be able to see the answers. That's it for logistics. I will turn it over to today's moderator, Kevin Maroney. Kevin.
Great, thanks, Dean. Welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. And I don't see anybody, but just in case, good evening. If some of you might be joining us from Géant's land and in Europe. My name is Kevin Maroney. I'm at Internet2. I head up the Trust and Identity and Net Plus services at Internet2, and I'll be joined today by Jessica, Heather, Kirk, and Erica, who are going to talk to you about hiring for identity and access management. And if Jessica could advance the slides. One of the reasons I was hungry to moderate today, if you could go back one slide, is this topic is so important to me. I wanted to at least make one point, and having an opportunity to look at the presenter slides, I think they're going to drive this home as well. In my last job, before coming to Internet2, I had a very close colleague that we would often sit in my office late after work days, and we always had this joke that if we talk about society and politics long enough, we would always end up at campaign finance reform and term limits. And it was true. If we talked for more than an hour, we would end up there. If you could go to the next slide, Jessica. Keep going back. Sorry, one more. There we go. Yes, the Wikipedia page. That's one point. Second point, if you haven't played this game before, it's fun to play. It's called Getting to Philosophy. If you go to Wikipedia page and you click on the first link, you count how many clicks it takes you to get from whatever topic you're on Wikipedia, you end up at philosophy. There are some programs that have actually been written, some of them visual in orientation, some of them command line, to help demonstrate this. And it's just a fun game to play, right? How far away can you get? How close can you get? Etc. So Jessica, if you could go to the next slide. And so when we, sometimes it requires a lot of dialogue, like I was talking about my friend back at my last job, and that the connection between ideas, when we tried to connect those ideas, we often end up at places that are difficult to understand and difficult to change. Next slide. And when you combine these two things, difficult to change and difficult to understand, next slide. Right? If you typed in identity management into this tool to play that Wikipedia game I talked about, there's about 15, 16 steps to get from identity management to philosophy. And if you sit down with a friend and you talk about identity and access management for a long enough time, if you could hit the next slide, please. If you have this conversation long enough and you think about it long enough, and this happens to me at places like Internet2 Global Summit, Géant's TNC meeting, Internet2 TechX, at breakfast, at dinner, maybe at the bar late at night. If you talk long enough about identity and access management, you end up at workforce and skills development and professionalization of a skill set in a workforce. And you'll hear words like mentor, apprentice, training, knowledge, guild, certification. But it has invariably become true for me the longer I've worked in this space and been a big fan of this space. And it is simultaneously difficult to change and difficult to understand. But what I mean by difficult to understand is difficult how to go about changing it is sometimes difficult. And I think what you're going to hear today from our four presenters is going to begin to help you with that. And I'm really glad that so many people have joined us because this is the foundational building block of how we're going to do more of the very good things we've done together over the last 20 years, how we're going to do more of it, and how we'll do it better. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kurt to dig into the meat of our presentation. Kurt?
Kevin, thank you so much for teeing this up. I'm Kurt Kelly. I'm the Vice President and CIO at Portland State University, and I had the distinct pleasure of working with Jessica Fink for a number of years here at PSU, and it's kind of nice to be on another presentation with her. So next slide. So why is hiring important? We'll get to, I love this quote, by the way, by Steve Jobs. I'm going to talk a little bit about hiring. I think of this presentation as tapas, if you will. This is going to be a sampling, a number of things that we could obviously go into more depth on in a number of places. I don't know, and you can look at Steve Jobs' quote here. I don't know if we're trying to hire the best people in the world, but we're definitely trying to hire the best people for our organizations. And that winds up being really important. And something that I find we don't always pay as much attention to as maybe we should. So next slide, Jessica. So I'm going to cover two things. I could have covered a bunch here. I'll probably say that more than once. I really whittled down a much longer presentation, but why does hiring matter? We'll go through that. And then what can you do to a couple tips on hiring the process for you before we go on. So next slide. So why does hiring matter? I think this will be discussed throughout today, but I think hiring for the IAM space is hard even to start with, and it really matters. And I'm going to start with maybe the negative of a bad hire, and then I'm going to go to the positive of a good hire. But I just grabbed some stats. We could make a long list here, but a bad hire, we've all seen a bad hire. I've been at this over 32 years. I've made a few myself, and I've watched a few happen across the organizations that I've been at. And the first thing you'll notice is decreased productivity. A bad hire not only is typically not productive themselves, sometimes they can drag down the rest of the team. There's some really interesting research, by the way, on negativity and culture and the cultural imbalance caused by negativity. And there's kind of this ratio, by the way, it's the same ratio that happens in customer service situations, where a negative experience, where in this case a bad hire, kind of has the power of 11 to 1, meaning it takes 11 positive employees to kind of counteract the negative effects of one negative employee. So it's pretty catastrophic to the culture typically if you've got a hire that doesn't work out. This is obvious. One person in your department that's not really feeling the love and not on board can create really bad customer experiences for the customers, and then they often are seen as the entire department. And then the other thing I will say is that obviously somebody who doesn't really fit, who you've hired, who didn't really work out well, those people tend to be highly disengaged. And Gallup has some really interesting numbers on employee engagement, but typically it's around 65 to 70% of employees across the country are not engaged, and a bad hire even makes that more pronounced. So that's the bad. Let's go to the good, Jessica, if we could. Next slide. So the payoff of a good hire. We could make a huge list here, but I pulled a few things out. The first one, and it's the inverse of that culture conversation, is the positive impact on your culture. And we all know what that means when you hire somebody that is really positive, who really pushes up the morale in your organization. And I listed on here a 17% increase in productivity. That there's some other stats that go along with that. Things like 20, I've got less turnover on here, but 17% increase in productivity. That's across the entire department. That's just not a stat for that good hire that you hired. That studies have shown a really positive employee coming in can lift, it's rising tide will lift all the water for productivity. Same thing with less turnover, by the way. That's 24%. That's actually a unit, a department number of 24%. A good hire, somebody that's the right fit, that really works out in your culture, is closer to 60% less turnover for that individual. So, I think there's obviously a lot more we could talk about here, but we've all experienced this in our lives, either a hire that we've done or maybe a peer that came into your organization. Next slide. So I like to say this, I say this a lot internally. I think this really resonates with people. At one point in time, I wrote an EDUCAUSE blog. It was called the $1 Million Decision article. I reread it recently. Don't go read it. You should never reread something you wrote a number of years ago, because then you immediately want to completely rewrite it and think it sounded somewhat foolish. But the concept is the same, and that is, if you hire somebody, people stick in our organizations in higher education. We've got people that have been here 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 35 years. I got somebody that's been here 40 years. And if you think about the cost of an employee, by the time you add up their salary and their benefits and other things, I typically think if somebody sticks over 7 years, we've spent at least $1 million on that employee. And if they stick for what often is the tenure in higher education, we spend $3, $4, $5 million on a person in the time that they're employed with us. And what I would say is that departments, if you went to buy a system or a piece of software or a solution, and that solution cost $1 million or more, there's a lot of process that goes into that purchase. There's a lot of vetting. There's an RFP or an RFI or an RFQ. The leadership of the organization pays a lot of attention, and a fairly high-level person has to, if you will, sign on the line to make that purchase. And I feel the same way about hiring, that we should treat our hires because the cost, I'm just purely talking about numerical numbers here, just the cost. But if you add in the negative effects above, or the increase in turnover if it's a negative hire, the costs are much higher than that. So, my summary would be, it's more than $1 million decision, and it winds up really, it's very important to all of us when we make that hire. Next slide, Jessica. So that was about how it's important. We could talk more about that, but I think it's obvious here. It is important. So what can you do? I had many slides on this about the entire hiring process, and I boiled it down to 2 so we could hit some highlight in the process. So if you go to the first one of the things that we did internally, and Jessica here was part of this process, and I think has some ownership for one of these things on the slide, is we tried to figure out, why do hires work in our organization, and why might they not work in our organization? And some of this boils back to a book called Hiring for Attitude, by the way, that we read as a leadership team. But we asked the leadership team, and we asked all the employees. For the leadership team, we said, please envision your top employees, and then write down, what are the attributes about that person that make them successful in your organization? And then we ask all of the employees, we had 115 people respond, and say, think of a peer that's really good. It's an excellent peer that you work with. What makes them exceptional? Write down those attributes. So we wound up with close to 70 attributes. And by the way, technical skill or experience ranked like in the 20s if you started ranking these attributes, because we're typically pretty good at defining and deciding if somebody has that technical skill to do the job. It's a very binary kind of decision. You can do tests, you can figure out ways to figure out if they really know the skill you're hiring for. But in this IAM world, in the worlds we hire for, those skills are very transient, and they wind up being much more a Swiss Army knife, if you will, in the environment. So we started centering in on what are the things that make our employees successful. And for us, it was being a team player, being innovative. Coaching we put here, but that's ability to be coachable, that they're proactive and communicative, they're good at communication. And if they don't have those skills, often they don't do so well in our environment. And then we backed up and rewrote all of our interview questions and redid our entire search process to drive at these types of skills to get here. And everybody would need to decide what their attributes for success are in your organization. They might look different than this. The other thing I would mention about these is not on this slide, is we have a foundation that we call emotional intelligence, which is kind of a summary of all these things. The people need to be emotionally intelligent to work well in our organization. The other thing I'm not going to mention here is DEI. We have a whole entire section we've done on that. That would be another presentation, but how we then make sure that we don't introduce bias into the process through all of this has been a really important focus for us. Next slide. So I eliminated a pile of slides, and I came to something that I've seen happen over and over in higher education in my career, plus 32 plus years, as I said. And that is that often I find people will settle in the hiring process. And I push hard to say, we should do a failed search. I'm happy to do 2 failed searches. And a lot of people will talk about the costs associated with a search or the costs associated with the position not being filled. But the costs of settling, the costs of a hire that don't work are far higher, are way more extreme than that. So I've really pushed hard and said, you must be willing to go back out if you're not 100% sure that you found the right person in that process. And you can define that based upon your attributes for success, or it could just be skill set. But you need to make sure that they've got what you need. And the other thing I will tell you is that often for the ones that don't work, for the hires that and by the way, there's some amazing stats on hires and the ability for somebody to stick past 2 years. And the stats would show we actually are not very good at the hiring process in general, that we should focus more on it. And I didn't include those here, but often For hires that don't work, there's either hints you pick up in the interview process, or sometimes you'll hear a hint in the reference call, like, please describe some way that that person could improve, or a failure or something. And more than once on a reference call, somebody will say something along the lines of, well, here was a struggle they had here, but our environment is such that that's probably, very specific here. And I'm sure that won't be an issue for your organization. And often if you're in the mood of settling, or if you're doing the references just to confirm that you want to hire that person, you'll buy into the story. But in my experience, usually that winds up being a problem. And it doesn't work out so well. So pay attention to those things. My last slide, next one. So just in quick summary, my challenge to all of you is, where does hiring fall on your priority list? And can you make sure that that hire fits into your culture? And when I say fit, I should back up and just say there's an entire process to make sure that bias doesn't enter into that conversation, but the culture does matter in your organizations. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to turn it over to Erica to take the next section.
Great. Hi, I'm Erica Lomax. I'm the Director of Identity and ITSM at Oregon State University. A little bit before we jump in, I sort of titled my presentation, "Why is IAM Hiring Hard?" In my own background, like many of you probably, I came at identity from a background in something else in IT. My own background was in web development, web intranet development, those sorts of things. And I worked in that in both the private sector and in higher ed. It's how I got into higher ed, was in that role. And I would say that my experience in hiring in those roles was, about the same. I'm looking for programmers. It's a specific skill set. It was never really a hard thing to do. I got into identity a little over 5 years ago. It is some of the hardest hiring I've ever done. Those of you who maybe have seen me speak at some Internet 2 events know that we are a department that is perpetually in need of people. And so we have attempted to do a lot of hiring. And as part of this presentation and growing out of some work that came out at TechX last year, I want to talk about why I think it's actually harder than hiring in other functions. And I'll just talk about that a little bit. Next slide, please. So first, oversimplification. But if you look at sort of industry and outside of higher ed, you tend to have sort of employee-focused IAM and customer-focused IAM. Different systems, different complexities. It's how industry tends to run. They don't tend to mix things. Next slide. In higher ed, we sort of complicated that. We put our customers and our employees into one identity system. We ask them to use the same tools. We use the same tooling to do it, the same teams. This presents a challenge in that we are different than industry. And I think that's not a surprise to most of you. It's why a lot of us feel that industry tools don't work for us. Our world is just different, but we did it to ourselves. Next slide, and poll 1, please. I'm going to ask some of you a few questions as we go forward here. First is, where does IAM report in your organization? So if you guys could answer that while I talk a little bit. Another area where I feel like higher ed and industry differ a lot is that in higher ed, where identity lives is sort of a hodgepodge. I recently did some research of my own based on our own higher ed peers at OSU, and I found that about half reported to security and half reported somewhere not security. In industry, identity is almost always seen exclusively as a security construct. People work for an Office of Information Security, they're security employees. How we self-identify as what we do, I think, becomes an important part of this conversation. So do we have results from the poll? Jessica, are poll results something we can see? Do I not see them?
This is Dean, Erica. Sorry, I'm new to the polling here, so I can see that 26% security, 42% infrastructure, 14% application development.
Okay, so that actually lines up with a little bit of what I see. My further research when I did this before was that while I looked at our peers and saw that I felt they were about 50-50 security, not security, what I also then did is who participates through groups like InCommon and Internet2, and they are almost, I felt that there was a much higher percentage of folks who are not part of security that I interact with at conferences and all of those things. Not exclusively, but this sort of lines up more with what I saw. Yeah, so what is IAM in higher ed? It's kind of a question. Can we move on to the next slide? This question for all of you to think about is really based on a conversation I had at EduCause a couple of years ago about the other function I work in, which is ITSM. And it's really, we all, most of all of us work at universities. Do your university courses teach IAM concepts? And did they touch on it at any further level than maybe it's part of a security course that you cover for an hour or so? It's a really interesting question that talks about how we get new identity people to be part of the community. The other question is given that, would you consider your own university's recent graduates to be qualified for jobs in your own organization? And if your answer there is no, that's clearly a concern for our organizations and how we move forward. If our own universities don't qualify you to work at our institution, we've got a big gap that we need to deal with. The other part of this that comes into play is if we're not teaching IAM concepts to our students. I know the student employees I work with say with like, well, I just want to go work in security. They don't necessarily have a focus, or I want to be a programmer. Most folks don't know what IAM is coming out of college, and so we have a real challenge with getting new IAM employees. Next slide, please. I think one of the biggest things we face as a challenge is IAM as a whole is about so much more than the tech. And I pulled up this great graphic from the Internet to Trusted Access Platform wiki page. Working in IAM to be successful, at least my experience on my own team, requires us to be experts in a lot of university processes. We need to understand the life cycle of a student and when they enter into our world, how they flow through, what that means for software access, and how they flow out. Students, employees, others. I don't know about the rest of you, but we routinely have conversations with HR and all of these folks about why is this person's access broken? Well, you have to understand the source system and how all the data flows and the relationships. We have a new-ish CIO and a new-ish CISO at our organization, and in a meeting with them the other day, they actually told me they felt like HR should pay me because I knew so much about how HR processes work. I think it's one of those challenges. Not only are we dealing with the tech, we're dealing with this. Next slide, please. While university process and data is true, the tech is a huge part of it. We, as teams, run a lot of functions throughout identity. One thing that is part of this is, I pulled up the list, the sort of categories and software out of the Trusted Access Platform. Well, I'm a big proponent of it, and I think that it meets the needs of higher ed. One of the challenges we face is that it is primarily higher ed specific. I can't go out and advertise for a co-manage expert, because who outside of higher ed is maybe a co-manage expert? Because we don't use tools of industry, our knowledge base of finding experienced folks is smaller. The other challenge we face is, I know that many identity teams are not exclusively identity teams. We often run other tools. My team, we happen to be the campus Google administrator. So, mail holds, tracking down lost files, all of those things. We do all of that on top of the identity work that we do. I know in talking to folks at TechX, I've heard some of you, you run your campus API gateways, you do these things. On top of identity, we run other tech. And so the skill sets, broad, are needed. Can we hop to the next slide? And I believe the next slide, if we could pull up polls 2 and 3 to go along with this. One other thing that comes into play is, how large is your team? This really addresses sort of the 2 polls that I'm pulling up here, one of which is about your bench depth. I'll tell you that at our institution, we're approximately 33,000 students and our identity team is 3 FTE. When you have 3 FTE and you run the amount of technology that we run, it is really hard to have a sufficient depth of knowledge about all of those tools across your entire team. How do you have experts in all of these things? When you're running Grouper and Shibboleth and Active Directory and LDAP and Midpoint and co-manage and all of these things, you both need to be an administrator of it. You have to understand all the tech, the security, maintaining, patching. It's a lot to run. And it often means that we run really, really thin on our ability to support things beyond a person and a backup. I know for our organization, I would say we tend to run as one person as local expert and one as a less experienced backup, and we hope we make it through. With 3 people, it's really hard to do anything else. I was going to say, there was a third poll. Could you pull it up? And this just sort of speaks to that other point of how large or small is your team. I was hoping to get some just feedback from all of you. I think while there are some large teams out there, smaller teams bring in the challenges of less bench depth and more experts. When your team is small, you don't have the ability to focus on bringing in lower mid-level employees. You need somebody who's an expert, not someone you're training. All of these present some significant challenges as we move forward. I'll give you guys a minute to do this. I didn't put any standards around what is the size of your team. I wanted you to sort of self-assess that. Okay, so this lines up with my own thought, is that most of us feel our teams are small. That is my experience from talking to all of you at conferences. So can we move to the next slide? So really sort of where I'm getting at is I think higher ed hiring in IAM is hard for a lot of reasons. We don't look like industry. So it's hard to attract even folks who work in industry IAM to move into higher ed IAM. Higher ed IAM does not have sort of a profile. We're not always security. We live in lots of places. The tools and how we run, not consistent. There's no real what is higher ed IAM. I think we've faced challenges as a function that there's no real pipeline. Students aren't necessarily learning about it. They're not learning about it in depth. How do you find entry-level IAM people? It doesn't really happen. We tend to build them ourselves. For that institutional knowledge, even if you do hire someone, if you hire from outside, building that institutional knowledge takes time. It's so much more than just the tech. I've got an employee on my team who's been here a little over a year, and he and I had this conversation the other day that he still feels like he doesn't know the answers to so many questions. Taking that just takes time. Yeah. Number 5, I pointed out there is that while there's a lot of tech, so much is higher ed specific, we again face that challenge in bringing new people into our community. Attracting even folks from industry or other places means we have insular tech that really only higher ed folks know. And then finally, when you have a small team, you don't have that ability to take on and build a lot of skills. And so it really challenges that you're looking for experienced people to leave maybe the function they already do and move into identity, which isn't always a challenge that a lot of people want to take on. So next slide, which is my last slide. This is sort of through a lot of hard lessons learned myself. This is sort of where we're at today. We're in a small rural-ish town about an hour and a half outside of Portland. We don't have a lot of community locally. And so what we've done is I look at, what is the basic role of this person on my team? And, are they primarily a programmer who does integrations? Are they primarily a DevOps person? Are they primarily a sysadmin? Someday maybe I wish a business analyst. We don't have one of those. But, what is their general sort of IT role on the team? And I tailor the PD to that sort of skill set. We assume that we will have to teach you the identity stuff, and more importantly, we assume we'll have to teach you the higher ed identity tool sets like Grouper and all of those sorts of things. The other side of it, though, is that we have found that there's a series of general skills you need to have in order to be successful. For us, you need to be able to apply knowledge with critical thinking. Identity, like a lot of sort of back-end teams, ends up as sort of a tier 3 level troubleshooter, you know, that like, why is this thing broken? You have to be able to apply knowledge. There's not going to be the just follow the 6 steps in the knowledge base and you'll always have the answer. That speaks to the troubleshooting skill set. We need the capability to learn new technology skills. Like many of you, our identity system is a hybrid of old, new, lots of things, and we're constantly moving it to new technology. You know, we're implementing Midpoint, we're doing these things where we're replacing scripts with other tools. We are constantly changing the technology we are using, and you need to have the capability to learn how to use new technology, not just the skills you already have today. And finally, a generalized interest in solving problems goes a long way. You know, people bring us situations that they need our help with. And, you know, having creative problem solving really goes a long way. Challenge with this, those general skills are so much harder to interview for and screen for than, you know, do you know how to write in a specific programming language? I think, you know, as we move forward here, this is sort of the end of my presentation. I'm going to move on to Heather, but I think there's further conversation about these topics that will be mentioned later that I think is really important. And with that, I'll hand it off to Heather.
Great, thank you, Erica. So I'm someone who wears a whole lot of different hats. Some of you may be familiar with my name because I'm the co-coordinator of ReFeds, which is the R&E Federation Consortia. Right now, however, I'm wearing the hat of the principal editor of ID Pro. Next slide. So ID Pro is a professional organization for identity and access management practitioners in every sector, including higher education. And part of the mission of ID Pro is to standardize IAM knowledge in the same way that the Project Management Institute normalized project management knowledge back in the 90s. So right now, we're still as an industry at that apprentice guild model that Kevin mentioned earlier. And it's problematic. So a lot of what, you know, Erica just talked about, the challenges within higher ed, as it turns out, you know what, that's pretty much a challenge across the board. And that's some of what I wanted to present to you today. Next slide. So my role in ID Pro is to help them pull together a body of knowledge. You know, what does it mean to be identity and access management? What are the features? You know, pull together that collection of material. And there's 2 particularly compelling things about, well, why do we even need to do this? Next slide, please. So every year, ID Pro does a survey. It's open to more than just its members. This is open to anyone that's willing to participate. We had about 200 people respond. And of that level of response, we've got a lot of people, more than half, almost 3/4, have more than 10 years of experience. Almost 75% have more than 5 years experience. You know, there's once you're willing to be a part of a professional organization, it's quite probable that, well, that's because you identify as I am an IAM practitioner. Cool. But now let's go on to the next slide. That same group of people, how long did it take you to feel actually proficient in what you were doing? Now, I'll admit right now, ID Pro is very heavy in the enterprise space. Higher ed, we've been off to our side doing our own very special things for a long time. But even in enterprise, look at this. You've got, you know, more than half of the people saying it took me over 2 years to even start to feel proficient, not expert, you know, or anything like that. And a whole lot of people still are like, yeah, no, I don't get it. This is hard. I used to be director of systems at Stanford University, and before that I was the senior manager of systems at Duke University. And I've been working with volunteer organizations for the last 10 years, mostly in IAM and standards. And this matches my personal observations pretty darn well. It's a minimum of 2 years for people to be able to figure out, you know, even remotely start to figure out the details that make IAM such an interesting place. Next slide. So this has to be a solvable problem. I mean, before the Project Management Institute started to do its thing and really form in the 90s, project management was not too dissimilar from IAM in terms of how people became project managers and what the different types of project management were, and being able to hire for something like that, having certification programs that help people be assured that the individual at least had some baseline that you could build on. And so one of the big things that ID Pro decided that they were going to do is this body of knowledge. Next slide, please. So as with all projects that get started from grassroots organizations like ID Pro, the content right now is coming from volunteers. As an aside, most of my life has been spent in the academic IT space and in academic IAM, but I sure do like partnering with some of the enterprise organizations because they often have a little bit more in the way of time and money to throw at these problems, and they're common problems. So if I can take advantage of their good nature to improve my favorite world of academia, I am all for it. They're still getting used to the concept, though, of sort of this cross-collaboration working with volunteers, but it's coming along. The first issue of the body of knowledge had 8 articles, and it included an introduction to the point of deciding on your administration of what your IAM is going to look like. It talked a bit about access control. It's talking about IAM architecture. It's talking about project management as specific to IAM projects. There's a review of one of the massive identity standards from ISO 24760. Now that's a pay-to-play standard, but we tried to write up enough information to help people understand, is this something that it's worth for you to pay money for? There's sections on laws and regulations, the GDPR, there's laws governing identity systems. You know, all of this stuff is coming through from the experts in the field that are part of ID Pro, though you certainly don't have to be a member of ID Pro to participate in this. Next step. So in order to pull this together, there is a publication process, and there's a timing for release of more information. There's this big collaboration step that takes as long as it takes, and that happens however the authors want it to happen, sometimes in Google documents, sometimes they mail Microsoft Word docs around, whatever. But once they're done with that, they submit to an open source publication platform called Janeway. I personally love Janeway because it helps me be assured that IPR for the writing has been handled. It gives me a way to manage the submission process, the peer review process, and the actual publication process. I do an initial review of the content, not as a subject matter expert, but sometimes that sneaks in a little bit. The body of knowledge committee reviews. I do a full edit to make sure that it is as readable as it could possibly be. The ID Pro board has a chance to comment on it. And then we do that final edit, sign off, and publish it. And publish a copy, not just on the website, but also in GitHub, so that if people want to submit issues or further engage with the material and offer suggestions that for improvement, it's a great place to capture that. This is not quite like standards development. We are perfectly happy to re-edit and revise and republish this material as we learn more things. So that's part of where the GitHub component is supposed to help us. We're aiming for quarterly releases with an annual compendium starting in June 21 that pulls all the releases together from the previous year. Our first one was the end of March. Our second one is mid-June-ish. Exact date is TBD, but I'm working on it right this very moment on my screen over on the side where you can't see it. Next slide, please. But here's the thing, you know, a lot of what we've recognized, and this also came up, is while there's a certain amount of baseline understanding that a digital identity is a thing, that attributes are a thing, you know, that's common basic considerations. But there is context-driven detail that is unique to the different sectors. It's not just enterprise and higher ed. We've got higher education, we've got commerce. Healthcare has some really interesting considerations that are fairly unique to them. Financial services, fintech, that's a big one. government, good heavens, is there a lot going on in the government identity space? And I'm not just talking US, I'm talking globally. It's quite possible. I've heard deep dark rumors that aerospace has some really interesting IAM activities as well. All of these feed into some profiles of IAM that I'm trying to start to pull together, because through all of this and building a body of knowledge and building, specific profiles of this that are appropriate to each sector, we want to put together a certification program that allows you to build on different components, because not only do you have different sectors which influence what you need to know, you also have, we'll call it different flavors inside. Are you aiming to be an IAM architect? Perfectly good goal, but maybe you want to be a hands-on implementer, because not everyone is suited to be an architect. Goodness knows I'm not, but give me something to implement. Absolutely, that's where my passion is. Maybe you want to be a project manager with a strong focus on managing IAM projects, which require so much more stakeholder engagement than you might otherwise find. So this is all in progress now. For the higher education profile, I have been talking with the InCommon Cacti group and getting them to chime in as well. And we're just brainstorming through the list right now of, well, what needs to be in this profile? What is unique enough to higher education that we want to actually find people to write articles on these things? So it's an in progress. I don't have dates for you yet because it is still brainstorming, but next slide, please. But if you'd like more information, you can write to info@idpro.org. You can write to me at editor@idpro.org. You can chime in on Twitter. You can go to our GitHub repository, which isn't linked here, but if you search for IDPros, you'll find it. And I'd be happy to have your input, your feedback, your thoughts, your suggestions, so that we can make this something that will help you as you're trying to train people and trying to hire people into your IAM programs. And with that, I think I hand it over to Jessica.
Thanks, Heather. Let me get my slide going. Okay. So hi, I'm Jessica Fink, and I'm the InCommon Community Advocacy Program Manager. And I used to be the Associate Director of Identity Access Management, Portland State, and worked for Kirk. Ran an IAM team there. And at Internet 2 InCommon, I work with the community and work with Aaron and Dean on a lot of the conferences, training, various things that we do to try to help the community come up to speed. So that's one piece of my role. And so one of the things when an organization comes to us, we have a recommended arc that's sort of come up over the last year or so of how to get started with InCommon. So, Erica talked about the different software components, and then there's some basic pieces of identity and access management. And so all of this sort of goes into an arc of the offerings that we have. And so we recommend folks start off with Basecamp. So that's our introductory, learn the basics, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then the second piece is some more in detail software training, if that's the direction you're going down of trying to implement some pieces of software. So we have trainings on each of the components. And then the other piece that we've been had going on for a long time is CAMP and ACAMP. And CAMP is where campuses share their stories about what they've been doing in identity and access management. And ACAMP is an unconference where we really do a lot of the innovation and the ideation and really what's coming up and thinking about the next areas for exploration around identity and access management. So you see the cycle, and then CAMP and ACAMP keep going. And then if you need another software training, you can come in that way. You get new people, you come bring them back to the base camp. And so there's a whole cycle of a lot of different offerings that we have. And so Basecamp, as I talked about, is an introduction to IAM basics. It's an introduction to the InCommon Federation, federated identity, and the whole piece that we have there. And an overview of our trusted access platform services and components. And we're doing Basecamp virtual this year, but due to COVID. And so there's a lot of flexibility. We're doing it over 5 days. The sessions will be recorded and available. And really what Basecamp is designed to do is just get you up to speed on community, the software, federation, and really how to get started on your IAM project or plan, kind of building that case. That's the last day of sessions. And so, yeah, if you're interested in that, take a look at the meeting. And that's coming up in July, just next month. The training portfolio. So each of these software components are different open source pieces of software. And so we offer the training in collaboration with folks in the community on each of these to really get hands-on experience with the different software components and get folks ready to implement those on campus. So you can take a look there. And then the last piece is CAMP and ACAMP. So it's really opportunities to network and present and collaborate with other IAM professionals. It's planned, CAMP is planned, ACAMP is on conference. We fill the slots with speakers every day. It's kind of exciting to watch everyone run to the board with their Post-it notes. And then really you can kind of see where things are going, what's coming up, what's interesting. And it's a really creative experience and fun to do. And so the idea is you keep going through CAMP and ACAMP every year. You can keep up with what's going on and keep up your training. So with your new hires, even if they're experienced IT professionals, 20, 30 years of experience within the space within technology, sending them to Basecamp is a really good idea, just to get their feet on the ground and knowing where to find different things within the community. And so it's a really good way to get them trained up and then kind of go to some of the other offerings as well. And then Heather mentioned that she has been working with Cacti with ID Pro, and Cacti is also looking at spinning up a recruiting and developing IAM resources working group. And so if you are interested, go ahead and fill this form out and we'll contact you either a Slack channel or an email list. We're also looking for leadership. So if you're interested in possibly leading such a working group to continue these conversations, as Erica pointed out, we don't have a lot of answers. We know what the issues are, where there are things going on. ID Pro is developing this body of knowledge. InCommon has these training arcs, these conferences. We want to know from the community where the gaps are and how do we fill some of these and really think about it and collaborate on how we can do that and move forward some of these. So if you want to keep that conversation going and are interested with what's going on with that, then indicate your interest there with I think Dean's going to put the link in the chat as well. And so, yeah, I'm going to hand it back over to Kevin at this point.
Great. Thanks, Jessica, and thanks to all the panelists. It's a problem worthy of attack, and I think the combination of all the material definitely shows that, demonstrates that there's a lot to consider when developing a workforce, developing talent, and hiring for IAM. And we have time for a couple of questions, should there be any. So I guess I'll do a little soft shoe to give you an opportunity, the attendees an opportunity to throw some things in the chat window if anything comes up. It's a lot to sort through. We have a question from Drew. Any IAM certification worth pursuing now? This was a hot topic a few months ago on the EDUCAUSE IAM, IDM, I guess it is, list. I'll just throw that open to all the panelists and see if anybody wants to jump in on IAM certifications. How do you get commas and numbers after your link and letters after your LinkedIn profile?
So there are not many right now. I'm looking for a list I actually pulled together a while back. So the existing certifications that I'm aware of. There's the Identity Management Institute that has 8 different certifications. The problem is I don't actually know anybody that has ever gone through this, which is for me a little disturbing because I'm in a position where I would know. The CISSP, one of the security domains it covers is Identity and Access Management. There are the Cloud Security Alliance. It doesn't have anything specifically named IAM, but some organizations will recognize them as being close enough for government work. Learning Tree has something for Identity and Access Management. Again, I don't know anyone that's actually gone through it. Similarly, Security Plus. It's actually not a whole lot out there.
So a couple of other questions coming in with 7 minutes, about 6 minutes left. Prince Saw asked a question about recruiting. Are there any channels that recruiters can send in jobs to attract IAM talent? Are there channels that you use? I might put maybe Kirk and Erica in their roles right now, and Jessica, of course, was in the same kind of role. Are there specific channels you use that you've had success with?
I would say my answer to that is no. And I'm trying to remember, I know at TechX last year, Mary McKee at Duke said she'd had some success with some specific mailing lists, and I do not remember them off the top of my head, but I'm sure that those are kind of topics that some of the working group can get into and maybe document.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I can't think of any that we would specifically use other than a pretty broad canvas of the technical background. And some of that's probably a function of this being a relatively new area within our IT space over the last few years. And often the need to kind of train our own, if you will. And maybe that'll transition here in the next few years.
And yeah, that's the approach that I used when I was at Portland State. Like Erica, we trained our own. I looked for a certain, I had 3 main areas of that I would look for. And then if they had 2 out of the 3, then they were trainable. And then we would build them up. And a lot of times I would look for development skills. And so we would just, again, train them up and then send them to a lot of these InCommon conferences and trainings. It's a way to get them trained up. But we would send things out to the InCommon IAM list. That was one area that we would send things out. But then it's a lot of the same people that already have jobs. But other than that, and the usual ones, that's what we did.
Good friend of the community, Esther Cha, University of Illinois, reports that she has some certifications. I think that's what Esther says. If I was interpreting the timing of Esther's comment in the chat window, and also reports that Zach from Nebraska has also run a certification gauntlet. And probably our last question from Tommy at SMU, do you find that including the term identity and access management or IAM in the job description attracts or scares away otherwise appropriate candidates? Is the vocabulary polarizing in good or bad ways? Is how I might reduce that.
I'll weigh in right quick, and I think this is really hard. One of the things that we've done in all of our job ads is we've tried to take a lot of the lingo out. We have found that adding too many specific things like that tends to dissuade historically marginalized populations from applying to the jobs. So we've actually had more success at getting a much richer pool of applicants when we've tried to leave terminology like that out. Because some people will just naturally not apply. They're like, I don't even know what IAM hardly is. I'm not going to apply, when they might have all the skills we really wanted.
And I'll chime in on that. One of my really good developers that I left back at Portland State, he actually had experience setting up single sign-on. He knew a little bit about shibboleth, but he was attracted to the job because we called it a software development. I asked him at one point, if we had said IAM, would you have applied? And he said he probably wouldn't have, because he didn't feel like he had the skills to do it, which echoes back to Heather's numbers there, that people don't feel like they're quite ready yet. So we would hire for software developers and then throw some of the skills that we wanted in there, and then we would find people with that. But all the ones that I ended up hiring said they probably wouldn't have applied because they didn't feel confident enough in their IAM skills.
I don't know if, go ahead, Erica.
I was going to say, I don't know because we have it in ours, and so I only know who actually applied. What I do know, though, is we hire some student employees, and I always appreciate their honesty. We hired one. She's like, she is a junior computer science student, and she, her comment was, "I didn't know what it was, but it said it was technology, and I don't know what I want to do, so it was worth a shot." We did hire her. She was great, but I think it actually might. It's hard to say when you have that bias of if you have the language, did it cause people not to apply? Because you'd have to know that people chose not to apply. But
There's hopefully this cultural reference will land with some of you, but sometimes looking for IAM talent reminds me of the first X-Men movie, where there are people in the crowd a little bit special and different from the rest. And those are the ones to try to seek out, to groom, to join the club of people who can make a huge difference at really complicated institutions doing really important work in their regions and their states for the nation and for the world. So with that, thanks again to the panelists for a really complete look at development and hiring. And I'm going to turn it over to Dean to take us home.
Okay, thanks, Kevin, and thanks to our speakers, Kirk and Erica, Heather and Jessica, and thanks for all of you attending today. And just to reiterate that this is a monthly webinar series, and we regularly send announcements to the participants list of InCommon. If you're not getting those announcements, or if you want to get these announcements, send me email woodbeck@internet2.edu. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good day.